bring us here. Not only because it's great to be in Budapest and to talk about these issues, but it actually gave us a chance to take a breather and look back and see what we are doing and fit it into a larger context. And so you should know that what we're talking about here is something that we're kind of analyzing and creating in real time. And this presentation is something that we have had very little time to kind of pull together, but we think that's actually where we are, is that we're still in the process of learning what we're doing and how we're doing it. And so hopefully that will energize our presentation rather than confuse it. We'll see what happens.
So we put this slide up to start, and we have a lot of material. We've been totally immersed in this movement for the last 8 months, and we have too much to say, and we have too many images, and so sort of, I don't know, it's probably going to run over, and it's going to be all disorderly and everything. But a central point we wanted to make is that we are working, in the art world. We're calling out economic injustices in museums and art galleries, auction houses, and art fairs, right? So we understand that what we're doing is in the tradition of what do you call it? Cultural institutional critique, except that it's not at the same time, because we are coming out of Occupy movement, and that changes everything somehow. The fact that we're activists coming out of the movement, and our understanding at the very core of what art is itself, what we're fighting for, is in relationship to the global movement. In other words, how art can be reconfigured, how art itself can become a tactic which is shared among the different nodes of the global movement. So,
so we just wanted to recognize the context in which Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Museums emerged. And a lot of what I think we're talking about here is our personal experiences. So the first time I experienced kind of a form of protest, which was an occupation of space and creating an alternative, potentially prefigurative, sustainable community, was in the university protests in Puerto Rico, which was actually a protest against American austerity measures, because Puerto Rico is an American territory. But we didn't get any coverage of that in the United States. But in Puerto Rico, it was a huge event. They took over 11 of the 12 university campuses, and one of the campuses, they actually held it for 60 days, barricaded off the university, and started organic gardens. We're doing yoga exercises. Created their own radio station. So they really had this amazing thing happening there that wasn't well publicized. Then of course Tahrir Square and this meeting in a central space, and calling out attention to economic and political injustices. And then also we know about Spain, what was happening there, but it also was happening simultaneously in Portugal. And this came through also another personal account of a friend of mine from Portugal, who was just astounded at the number of people who came out and sat in the squares and just talked to each other late into the night, complete strangers around political issues and finding connections in those spaces. And so finally, the other thing is, I think, to recognize the importance of WikiLeaks and the exposure of the inner workings and the mechanisms that were keeping this system going, that was completely invisible to so many people. I mean, I think a lot of us assumed there must be something, but when it became so apparent, I think that was a real spark for people, that this wasn't just kind of like capitalism happening, it was being created in a certain way, this crisis.
So, with this backdrop, Occupy Wall Street started in New York on September 17th, as people know. And actually, I think the organizers, the pre-Occupy organizers, who were meeting in a different park, came up with this language, the 1%, 99%. Obviously, nothing is invented here. We can find references to the 1 and 99% through our history, but this was very powerful in New York particularly, because New York City is one of the most wealthiest and most unequal cities in the world. And if you go there, you may not see that because you are likely to go into Manhattan, but Manhattan is surrounded by Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn, which have incredibly poor areas. And New York City has the same wealth disparity as Honduras as a city, and it does have 10 million people, so it may have a similar population to Honduras. So that is particularly resonant in New York, and we saw that, and the particular experiences of Occupy Wall Street in New York, the way the NYPD dealt with Occupy, the way that occupiers saw themselves, has that backdrop of a place with incredible wealth disparity in a wealthy nation. Because in other cities in America, the United States, there were completely different power relationships even between the authorities set up. So when we say 1%, this is what we mean, and this is just a fraction actually, because here the 1% is like everyone who makes more than $385,000. But if you, as we all know this in this room, I know, but if you take people who make more than 5 million, that 1% of 1% is like totally off the charts. So in the U.S., we're experiencing the wealthy pulling away rapidly, and that's changing everything. And
this is actually what the wealth that's reported for tax purposes, and as we know, there are huge, I think the last count was $5 to $7 trillion in tax shelters offshore. So that was just a representation of what people are actually telling us the disparity is.
So actually this goes perfectly with the last presentation, because I feel in some way what you were saying, sort of studying us. But right, it's good to get together and understand more about yourself. But we've sort of divided, after there's some kind of reflection we have access to now, we've divided the Occupy Wall Street experience into 4 different stages, and they pretty much go with the seasons. So the first stage is September, basically. Then we move into late fall, then the winter stage, and now the spring and summer. So in the first stage was the exciting, euphoric moment of a new space opened up, and in particular a very unique space for New York, which is, where everyone walks from point A to point B pretty much. And as part of the neoliberal picture, there are very few spaces to congregate in a free, in a way without kind of a boundary. And the first thing the amazing thing is that there was this kind of social software that was brought into the occupation, which was general assemblies, a language of horizontality, so people understood that there weren't going to be leaders. And these general assemblies were like big campfires. They were really magnetic, amazing spaces that unified Zuccotti Park. And every day there were 2 general assemblies in the beginning, and it was a really wonderful thing to be part of these general assemblies. And they were highly functional for about the first 3 weeks. So much so that that was the only time that the whole Occupy Wall Street movement was able to come out with a consensus text. And that was a statement of occupation, which was essentially calling out the injustices as we saw them, which is all about wealth disparity, and saying we see that this is going on. We see that this is going on. No, answers were not proposed, but certainly the process of getting together in this kind of assembly and using these hand signals and saying, we have a language to talk about these injustices and we'll use them together, that was enough. Well, then there was there was a kind of anarchist backdrop to it, which is that it was understood that that the rules of the game, so to speak, were that we were going to be horizontal, but also we had autonomy. And that was, and both of those things contributed to a sense of freedom being in Zuccotti Park. because you knew that there was a lot of power in putting our voices together. That was the reason we were able to be there. That there was power in bodies holding the space. That was and we would do that by all agreeing not to step up and try to be the leader. But autonomy meant that people could bring their own creative voices into the space. And it felt like it was culture shock moving from Zuccotti Park to the next block over, because it was not the New York that I lived in New York for 10 years. This gentleman's been there for 30 years. You get to know a place, and it completely transformed everything you knew about New York, because you could just kind of talk to a homeless person in public or a business person in public. Social barriers were pretty much broken down for the first few weeks. And as an artist, I got out of my studio and I wore a big piece of my art, which is a big coin on my head. And I made a practice of walking around the park and yelling rhetoric to the bankers dressed as a coin. So these are just maybe familiar images.
Yeah, so quickly, actually the very first day, somebody brought tons and tons of peanut butter and bread and fed us and kept us in the park, so that there was already a sustainable system being built there. And quickly around that, working groups started to form. And
whoa, that's me. Sorry.
Oh.
Preview. Oh, there's the coin.
So people were gathering in the parks and making connections, and we started forming into working groups almost immediately. And then there was also a technical group that was starting to help us build a social platform on which our groups could kind of start creating smaller ways to connect through email. And so part of where it started happening to me was I immediately connected my background of activists and academics investigating some of the issues were all of a sudden becoming very interesting to a lot of people, and bringing in a lot of the people who have been thinking very deeply about the issues of the occupation. And so we started a series of open forums where every day we would bring in people who had been thinking and working around issues of the financial crisis, around alternative models, around direct democracy, and bringing that information so that people had access to it. And that was done in collaboration with people that I just met with in the park, that were there, and that we actually heard. Yeah, with the picture. Anyways, there's a picture that was taken by somebody randomly of me. I was meeting one person that actually another. Yeah, this is it. It's just completely random that I was there meeting someone to plan an open forum, and the tall guy with the beard came up to me and said, "Are you here for the open forum?" I said, "Yeah." "Are you Eric?" He said, "No, I'm Vincente, but I'm here for the open forum too." So there was these two separate groups that were planning an open forum and planned to meet in exactly the same spot where we could know about each other. And so of course we were like, well, maybe we should join forces, and we did, and that became the Empowerment and Education group that has since then changed and transformed quite a bit. But it just speaks to the potential of bodies being in this public space and the spontaneous events that come out of that it wasn't possible before in New York City in this kind of way.
Okay, so Maria mentioned working groups. So the way people may know this, but the way it was set up is that there was for the first stage, which was all about the park. A lot of our energy was holding the park and sustaining the park, and there was some kind of idea in our heads that was a possible sustainable system, like we were creating a state, and the General Assembly was the government, and the sub-government was a bunch of working groups, some of which were functional, like providing food to everybody, safety, patrol at night, legal aid for people who got arrested, which happened every single day constantly. And then there was also our arts and cultural working group at the beginning. So there were these, it was divided into these general bubbles of kind of, culture, and it was ministries really. And So we somehow, it felt like this is it. We have our state right in the middle of New York, and this is good. And so this is the first Arts and Culture Working Group. The working groups were interesting because they were just announced in the General Assembly that a bunch of artists would meet over here after the General Assembly. And so what do? You know, and this is New York, so there's over 100,000 artists in the city. And everybody flows in there, and then we're all high in this moment. And we decide, and what we're going to do with art was a big question. And there were many struggles within the group that weren't even clear to us yet, right? It was a sort of a wide net to cast. So what we actually used to do in these working groups at the beginning is people would come in with proposals. Everybody would listen to each other's proposal and give consensus on the proposals. Very few of which would happen because there were so many ideas going that it took a long time to put them into effect, and we took almost all of our time just hanging out and soaking in this moment. But we wanted to bring our ideas forward. That was the first stage of organizing in the arts.
So kind of looking at this working group model and the first coming together in the big GA and this quickly separating out people into working groups where they're actually kind of forming stronger connections within a group, because the GA was 200 to 300 people, so there wasn't a strong kind of connection built between people there, but that was happening in the working groups. And so what happened is that there's these larger overarching kind of arts and culture, but then within that, even smaller groups would form. So for example, empowerment and education, there was the open forum, but there was also autonomous university, there was also student debt. And so these then became smaller, more practical working groups. And the same in arts and culture, where there was arts and culture, Occupy Museums was a direct action group, and there was also arts and labor and alternative art economies. And yeah, and so there's this flow between groups as well, where there was beginning to see crossover and cross-pollination that would happen, where you would be working on something in arts and culture, but it also meshed exactly what was happening in empowerment and education. So people were starting to see how these things were all kind of interconnected and we could work together. And also, and then there was this kind of transformation of the kitchen, the practicality of feeding everyone in the square, and then taking the next step of like making the connection to the food sources. And so there was this whole movement of Occupy Farms, where they were given farmland in order to start growing food for the occupation. And then that connected to a sustainability and climate justice working group too. So there was this kind of flow between the groups as their issues became more tied together in practical ways. There's also I think the strengths of Occupy Wall Street is that we're creating this kind of sustainable system in that every aspect of what we need to get along as human beings is incorporated. So there is a strong mediation and nonviolent communication component that is given people in the working groups have access to. There's also a group that was called facilitation that would teach people how to facilitate groups, which is very important skill to have, because a lot of people were meeting who had never worked together in a group in this way, and to communicate and get things done, to introduce these techniques, there was a team of people working to educate us around that. And then, as I mentioned before, things are morphing into different kind of interest areas, and so the open forum then morphed into kind of a discussion of the commons and the importance of the commons as a way for people to organize and to care for the shared resources, and then that became a natural connection with the mutual aid. So you can see that this is like this web that is becoming kind of intertwined and mutually dependent, and we're learning from each other and we're sharing with each other, and we're all because we come under this larger umbrella of Occupy, and we recognize that we're all kind of working on the same thing, which makes what Occupy Museums does different from any other art protest institutional critique, is that we're in this system that's going to sustain us over the long run, hopefully. And then the other thing that happens when people are constantly shifting and moving out of these groups is that there's a resistance to hierarchy, there's a resistance to leadership, because there's always a new direction to move, and people don't have to stick in the same groups. They can actually move into other groups as their interests and emotions and proclivities change. There's another group that they can kind of work with to meet those needs.
So then we move to stage 2, which is stage 2 kind of, I mean, these aren't marked by particular moments maybe, but maybe they are. The movement blew up at some point. The first few weeks was when, when actually the General Assembly was the most effective, and also when the media hadn't quite fully caught on to it. And a month later, the whole park was surrounded by CNN and New York One and all these media outlets. And the police made a few errors, like spraying pepper spray in the face of some female protesters who weren't doing anything, which got on camera and went viral through social media. And next thing we knew, we had an international movement, which we didn't start. It was already in the air from Tahrir Square and everything, but now it was coming out of, had Occupy Wall Street name on it. And there was, for lack of a better word, an exceptional situation going on where we had a lot of capital on our side. We had all kinds of media access. I mean, you didn't have to do anything. You just walked into the square, and next thing you were talking to Fox News. And that's, and that's like, that's like cash money. That is capital. And we did our best to use that. But just generally, Occupy was becoming a household word, and we were still in the park, so there was a kind of a disconnect between the geographical location in the city and the fact that it was kind of in the air. So it was time to, with the backdrop of what we had become, it was time to move out from the park, both geographically, and move out from the rhetoric we were using, which was about Wall Street and financial inequality, and look at the larger picture, because under the neoliberal system, inequality permeates. So that's what was going on. So, and another thing I touched on before was that there was a new power to the word, and it's really particular because we live in the information age, and words are flying around left and right, and manifestos and kind of central documents seem impossible somehow. But Occupy brought back the loaded, important, totally earnest word. And we saw that in the Statement of Occupation, which was written by consensus by the whole General Assembly, basically, or voted on by consensus. And then I began to write. So I wrote a manifesto, essentially, which was not ideas that I had thought of myself. It was coming out of conversations, my experience as an artist in the very unequal New York art world, which was about why we should occupy museums. And when this manifesto, it was a statement that was a call to action for an action at the Museum of Modern Art. We were going to do a General Assembly there, but it went out about 4 days before the action, and there was a huge media frenzy upon the issue of this manifesto on my Facebook page. It went through a journalist. It got picked up by, LA Times and Washington Post and New York Times and everywhere, like 10 or 15 different news outlets. And it was unlike Occupy Wall Street, which was at that time kind of cool, Occupy Museums was controversial. Because people said, why do you hate museums? And then, of course, why do you hate art? And then, all kinds of things, and personal attacks. Actually, because I showed at the time of the gallery. This artist is just part of the problem and all this kind of stuff. So it was a pretty intense media frenzy. There was kind of a perfect storm in that way. But the action itself, so they actually brought up the action. For the action, we started in Zuccotti Park, Liberty Square, and we sort of, just as the kind of thesis of this talk, we started in the movement. We made announcements. Now we're going, like mic check. You know, we're going to the Museum of Modern Art. You know, and everybody, oh yeah, let's go there. And came out of whatever else they were doing out of the park, and then we got in the subway and we headed uptown to the Museum of Modern Art. And this is like a blurry picture. I think this was taken by a famous art critic who snapped it and then put it up online. But then we created a small general assembly outside the Museum of Modern Art. The police were there waiting for us, and we did this kind of negotiation with power. We had enough people to actually successfully negotiate not to be put in the barricades to the side, but to stay right in front of the door. And actually, not in this action, but another one, the way the facilitator was able to do it, which was to request that the police only speak to us using the people's mic. So if the police would say, you have to move over there, the facilitator would say, we just have to repeat it, you have to move over there. And we would all say, you have to move over there. And then the facilitator would say, okay, it sounds like they want us to move over there. How do we feel about that? You know, this means not so good. So then we would negotiate. And I mean, the police fell for it that time. But once you fall for that, it totally changes the power relationship, because it's a democratic dynamic that everyone sort of hooks into it somehow. But at this General Assembly, we opened Stack, which meant that it was an open space for people to raise their own critique, and we had people who were museum guards who felt like they were, kind of, their labor was being abused and they weren't being respected in these kind of, luxury, functions at the museums, for example. We had unpaid interns in the art world who were talking about that. So a lot of issues that became part of our critique popped up. So, and then one critique we had in knuckle effect. Why? So just generally to say, people ask why occupy museums and not art galleries, the private market, where presumably the problem kind of originated. And the answer that we had is that museums are symbols. And in the system as it exists now, it's like a pyramid, right? And the pyramid is about how to turn art into an asset. And the way you do it is by giving museum art kind of a gold standard value. And the only ones who can really do that are museums. So museums, as a symbol, stay on the top of the pyramid that contains galleries, auction houses, and nonprofits as well. And they're kind of like the ratings agency and actually the authority on that system. So we can go through this.
Yeah, so this is trying to summarize a lot of the issues that Occupy Museums has been dealing with in this kind of recognition that it's replicating the structures of neoliberal capitalism. But what's happening is that there's a financialization of culture, a commodification of art that is really the value of which is really controlled by the auction houses, and there's a conflict of interest in that the people who are on the boards of the auction houses and the board of the museums often overlap and are operating in the same circles. So they have a direct ability to influence the value of the items that they're buying.
So do you guys know what swag is? So swag is this new kind of sexy, like post-mortgage crisis market explosion term. And swag, it means silver, wine, art, and gold. And and this is very important because this is kind of at the core of the financialization of art. Art is now a tangible asset. At post-speculative market that's so crazy because people are betting against themselves and stuff like this, what you do is if you're the 1% of the 1% and you have way too much money, you put some money in speculation, and then you put Then you put some money in tangible assets, like gold. That's why gold is going like this, right? But the financialization of art means that art is, one would hope, if you have that, if you're investing in it, becomes a gold standard. I mean, and we know that old masters are already more standard than gold, but can contemporary art make it into that level as well? That's the question.
Yes, and the answer is yes. Yes, 2 days ago, there was just a world record set for a Rothko painting, and so it's the world record for a contemporary art object being sold. I don't remember.
Edward Munch.
No, it was just 2 days ago at Christie's art auction. But anyway, so what we see is this replication of the capitalist system where there is an abuse of labor that is created by this false scarcity, which this false scarcity creates an art market which can be manipulated. And what the fallout of that is that there is a lot of people who are clamoring for the access to what is seen as accessible, such as the art star potential. Like when you're in art school, you're taught to kind of play in the gallery system, and what your goal is to become an art star. But the reality of the situation is that that's not actually possible for the vast majority of people. So what that does is create a lot of people who are willing to exploit themselves in order to try and get to that unattainable place. And not only that, but it also creates competition between artists. And that's all that whole environment is fostered within the university system, in which the students are incurring huge loans. So not only do they come out of the other end of art school with this idea that they're going to be able to pay off their loans by becoming an art star, but they also have they're already positioned to enslave themselves to the system of capitalism, and then they soon filter into the creative industry, such as advertising and marketing, and so that you can see how this cycle of consumption is also glamorized through the power of art.
So these are, so I created this thing, if you read down, it says false scarcity. And these are some of the critiques that emerged, not at the very beginning of Occupy Museums, but as they emerged through actions and through staging actions, and researching what was going on behind where we were about to occupy, which we'll talk about. But these are, so financialization, abuse of labor, student debt entrapment, speculation, control by philanthropy, which we'll talk about in a second, auction house corruption, ravage of the commons, inequality through competition, which Maria just talked about, tired out ideas, yearn for change. And the opposite of false scarcity is abundance, or perhaps what is already, because of the 100,000 artists in New York, there are maybe 100 in circulation. And where does all that other labor, creativity, effort, social relation, where does that all go? And we think that energy is part of the market, but it's the most disempowered base of the market. So there is in fact an abundance.
And I think that I just want to go back up to the ravage of the commons, where is this idea that we are sold that art is something that you can buy, it's something that can be commodified, and that we have the same kind of ideas that are going around education and around knowledge and ideas, that these are things that we can have ownership over. And I think that the implications of this ravage of the artistic commons is that it's creating a very narrow idea of what art is. It's something that can be bought and sold as an item for speculation, and it's a playground of the rich. So it's kind of looking at how our relationship to art and culture has actually shifted from the neoliberal agenda.
Okay, so how are we doing with time?
Yeah.
What else can we let's do
Well, how much time do we need?
how much time do we have?
Well, yeah, I mean, you started a bit late, so it's not right.
5 more minutes?
So we better.
See, that's done.
Let's do the action on the last.
I'm enjoying it.
Okay. I knew it would be like this. There's no way. This is this. And when I was flying from New York by way of Zurich, and I walked to the end of the plane, who should I walk by in first class but Jeff Koons? That was interesting.
And we wanted to show this because this is how Sotheby's tells their story, but one thing that they're missing is their relationship with the museums and the public culture and how they manipulate that in order to change the art market.
Right, so here you see the relations, and we learned through, when we occupied MoMA, one of the first things that came up was that Sotheby's Auction House and Museum of Modern Art, a speculative institution and presumably a public art institution, share board members. So there's like, you know, the same system we have in Washington where people from the banks then graduate and, you know, go back and forth between Washington positions is going on in the art world, except in the art world they can do it at the same time, which is, you know. So there's, and the people making Jeff Koons, just to make an example of him since we flew on the plane with him, the people making his art you've never heard of and they don't get paid very much, and they're kind of like McDonald's workers, so it's a, you know, it's that same corporate use of and disempowerment of labor that we see in the art world. And the cult of the individual, and the artist as this, you know, hyper-individualized genius kind of figure who is completely associated with luxury. I mean, that is the new artist, and that is somehow the lottery system that all artists would love to find themselves the winner of. And so at Sotheby's Auction House, these are the Teamster art handlers who have been locked out of Sotheby's, and they're, you know, making $35,000 a year, and Sotheby's just had a record profit year in a 200-something year history, so somehow they chose this year to lock their art handlers out because they want a fair contract. So these kind of contradictions are abundant because of the world we live in. And so in Occupy Museums, we have taken up the tactic of finding some of the most abundant and interesting contradictions and going there. So the tactic, we call it beautiful actions, or I call it beautiful actions. And we'll talk about one a little later, but you sort of go through the culture itself to find where there's a node, basically. So back to the, you know, the booming art market is just exactly the same as the 1% story. It's exactly the same thing. And we have Ronald Lauder, who is one of the wealthiest people in New York and has started his own museum, which is a tax haven, right?
Yeah. So I guess we'll talk about, since we only have a little bit of time, we'll talk about one action. And this was an action we did at the Museum of Natural History, which is very beloved in New York City. So it was a little bit of a risk, but this was actually the first museum that we entered. And this was our kind of experimenting, our beginning of experimenting with the museum space as a public space. And we went inside the museum and we actually held an alternative tour where we looked at the influence of philanthropy on the content in our museums. And so we looked particularly at David Koch, who is the second richest man in New York City next to Mayor Bloomberg. And he has given huge amounts of money to the Museum of Natural History in order to fund the Tyrannosaurus Rex room, which sounds really great until you realize the agenda, the underlying agenda of his donation is to rewrite the history of climate change, and that he's telling the story about the Ice Age and refusing to connect it, and kind of incorporating that natural phenomenon to the current climate change phenomenon. He's done this specifically in the Smithsonian Institute, but also here. And what the problem is when in the American public institutions, the vast majority of the money comes from corporations and extremely wealthy individuals. So that model of dependency.
Let's do the second one.
Okay.
So we're gonna finish?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say that we went into this museum, we called out this story that is underlying all that people see that is never being told. And we also experimented with our own bodies in that we sat down on the ground in the museum and we talked about the influence of philanthropy and its distorted way of representing and telling the story of our cultures.
So let's end on this. Can you end on this section?
Yeah.
Okay. So and just to kind of, maybe to sort of finish the story about Liberty Square, because Liberty Square in the beginning, remember, was like a special, very special utopian space where we were all focused on being there and defending the park and making it like a kind of a civilization unto itself, and we had our own language and everything. And then, and as people know, it was eventually evicted by the NYPD. But before that happened, life in Liberty Square had become kind of untenable, and there was nasty stuff going on, like people doing all kinds of drugs and violence and stuff like that. But there was also an inability to use it really for organizing purposes. And it was still a powerful symbol to occupy a public park in New York, but it was also, it was kind of a nasty symbol too, because it sort of emanated like recklessness, sort of kind of recklessness, and even violence.
Yeah, but I think that we tried to deal with this kind of huge imbalance influx of a lot of the problems that exist within the capitalist system, because capitalism spits out so many people. If you don't fit the model, you get spit outside. If you have mental health issues, if you have psychological, poverty issues, if you have health issues, like the system doesn't sustain you. So I think the potential of Zuccotti Park drew those people to it, and it became a visual symbol of everything that is wrong with capitalism, that there's so many people who are not able to survive in a decent way within the society that we now live in.
Right, and then and the way that the park was evicted was that a gigantic army of police showed up in the middle of the night. All the occupiers got a text message that night, and a lot of us showed up. I wasn't sleeping in the park then, so showed up in the middle of the night to defend the park. But defending the park, it's a joke really, when you are going against a militarized army that's sharing tactics with people in Afghanistan. So there was a huge buffer zone also created against the press, and it was very dispiriting, to say the least, to be involved that night, because they know the crowds, the police know how to deal with crowds. Yes, they know exactly how to deal with crowds. I mean, they have PhDs researching that shit. So basically, so we at Occupy Wall Street, we did well when we were in front curve. When they didn't know what we were doing yet, when it hadn't occurred to them, that's when we were winning. And we did have some wins. There was a time before the eviction when Bloomberg tried very hard to evict us, and we won because we filled the park with people and kind of had good sentiment. We were evicted, and after the eviction, there was an opera at Lincoln Center, which was Philip Glass's opera called Satyagraha, which was from the 1980s but was revived recently. And Bloomberg and David Koch, who Maria mentioned, is one of the major funders of Lincoln Center.
And we had actually tried to do an occupation event in Lincoln Center the week before and had been chased out by the police. So we actually made a big we let a lot of people know that we were going to be showing up again in Lincoln Square, which is a public space. And when we got there, it was barricaded off. So we got there to kind of call attention to nonviolent protests and to call attention to the fact that what was going on in the theater was exactly what was going on in the street. And Bloomberg, who was funding the opera to glorify Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, was actually the one that was suppressing the actual nonviolent movement on the street. And so what we wanted to do is draw the connection between this glamorization and separation of nonviolent protest and the actual suppression of it within our own city. And we managed to get Philip Glass to show up to read part of the last part, some words from the opera through a mic check. But what happened was, as the opera goers left the theater, we were standing at the bottom of the public plaza, and we had been talking with the designers of the opera, so we had made kind of visuals that replicated some of the visuals within the opera. And so when they came out, we were all standing there and almost like a deja vu of what they'd just seen in the theater. And the cops were trying to keep them from joining us. And they were trying to join us, come. join us. And they were kind of standing there not knowing what to do, obviously infused with this kind of revolutionary potential in the opera. And when, when the cops tried to stop them, they didn't know what to do. And what happened was we then said, we'll fill glasses here and he's going to read. And we have video of him. You can see the opera goers just coming and merging with us. So there was like the opera goers on one side of the fence and the Occupy Wall Street on the other side of the fence, and we together through the people's mic read the Philip Glass words from the opera. It was a really amazing and moving moment. And then we proceeded to have an open GA discussion on a very cold night until I think 1 o'clock in the morning, where 30 to 40 people were allowed to speak about issues of art and culture, around issues of labor. It was just a really amazing moment where Occupy Museums joined with the larger OWS kind of direct action group. And we have a lot more to say, so maybe that'll come out tomorrow in the workshop, because I think we gave about half.
Yeah, I mean, we're at
say.
stage 2. Stage 2 of 10.
Yeah.
Just kidding, 4. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Did you organize the occupation of Sotheby's where people stood up and said factors about facts and they were escorted out by the security? Do you know what I'm talking
recently?
about?
The one last week?
I don't know. No, I saw something.
At MoMA? Was it at MoMA? Well, just to give a background, we recognize that the struggle of the Sotheby's workers is very similar to kind of calling out these general inequities and exploitation within the art world. It's just a very, very stark manifestation of that kind of abuse of labor that happens throughout the system. So we've been showing up, going to their actions, and they're showing up to our actions as well.
And that started from the beginning. I mean, one of the critiques of Occupy Museums from the beginning, I think was reasonable, was that it was a creative, we're in the world of art, and it was a creative, action and very generalized. And so, it was going to stay that way, basically. And the first action was at MoMA, and we were just talking about, MoMA is the problem, museums are at the top of this market, and my manifesto was full of language that got attacked for that. And it was actually very expedient for us to make an alliance with the union, because although we may not agree with everything the union stand for, Occupy movement is broadly about solidarity between the 99%, like for real. And so they had their struggle predated Occupy by 2 or 3 months, and then since then there's been a number of different groups within Occupy. There's a specific union group that's been working with the Teamsters, and we've organized like 6 or 7 actions with them.
Can I ask one more? It's not a practical thing, if I may. Do you feel that? Oh, sorry, I can speak pretty loud too.
Yeah, but it's for a street.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Just speak into it. No, there's a switch somewhere. Oh, on the bottom. Okay, got it.
So my question is then, do you feel that the movement has evolved to become part of people's social life in New York City? Because this is my sense, is that now this is how this is their social life, and they gather here and do things and gather there, and that they interact, like you said, talking with homeless people or businessmen who you wouldn't find in your pre-existing social circles. So I was wondering if you think that's happened to the movement, and in that sense, will it allow the movement to persist, but not in a way that maybe people expect?
I think there are very strong social relationships that have developed out of the working groups, because these are people that are meeting on a regular basis and aligning along political, but also creating strong social bonds. And we're educating each other and we're sharing resources, so there's this kind of cohesiveness in our groups that I think is quite unique in a lot of ways, because amongst people who have just recently come together. But there's definitely my relationship to the city has changed significantly, and now I know there are places I can go where I will see people that I know, and that's, that didn't exist before. And actually, I think that is a direct result of New York being built up around capitalism. That there are no central meeting places. Everything needs to be planned. Everything needs to be arranged. And now that actually doesn't, isn't the case in New York City. But I don't want to portray it as if everybody in New York City is involved in Occupy, because it actually is a very small group of us.
I mean, on that, so you mentioned at the beginning I was doing Occupy subways. So there was this vision, New York City has like almost 10 million people in the greater New York City, and has the wealth disparity of Honduras. So there's neighborhoods that are incredibly poor and are where almost all the violence is centered, for example. And it seemed at the beginning, like, of course, if we're going to have a revolution, it's not going to be the first people who showed up. It's going to have to be the whole city, because the people who really need it, all the foreclosures, there was like one foreclosure in Manhattan. There was a bunch of foreclosures in New York City, and they were in East New York and the Bronx and stuff like that. So Occupy subways, was an action at the beginning to travel through the subway system, which is like a veins and capillaries through the city, and connect and spread the word, where the 99% really do travel together. And there was a time in the fall where it was like, if you said, I'm from Occupy Wall Street and blah, 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 then everyone would light up and it would go well. And it was like having some cold water poured on your head a few weeks ago when I occupied subways. And I said, I'm from Occupy Wall Street, and I mean, most people in New York didn't matter much, or they moved on. I mean, that's the reality here. Like, let's not batter on the bush. I mean, like, most people in New York, most poor people of color, are not connected to the movement at all. Would like to stay away from it, because the movement has been associated with police violence, to which they are much more vulnerable than Maria and I. And so, when you actually, has it changed in New York City? No, absolutely not. Not at all. Not in the least. But, but how do you get, the question we are asking, and it's a long-term question, how do you get there? How do you create a group of people which is sustainable, so that we don't pop up and go away, but we continue to work together, connect up, expand in some way. That's where we need to go.
But I actually do think that we have a different experience, because I've been working in doing outreach in the outer boroughs, and I do think that there's a willingness to kind of engage in these ideas in the disenfranchised communities that don't feel comfortable kind of aligning with the popular movement from the beginning, because they're the ones that usually get the most beaten down if things aren't successful. I am starting to sense that people see that there is a potential here, and that we are here to stay. So it's kind of maybe a different experience, but I see people recognizing that there is a potential here. And it is actually still covered quite a bit in the newspapers. And May Day, we had 30,000 people on the streets, so I think that brought a good spirit back to the Occupy movement.
I agree.
Okay. There was another question?
Thanks very much. I really liked your presentation. I completely appreciate that you probably have 10,000 more things that you want to say. What I really liked about the presentation was the focus on labor, beginning from the coin, speaking to the banker. I immediately thought of the question that Marx raises of what would commodities say if they could speak. Like that really resonated with you as labor.
Money does talk. When money talks, exactly. When money talks, money says, "I must change."
Yeah. But also that when you're talking about art and some of the problems, that the museum guard speaking about the issues for him and the political issues in his workplace, but also the kind of the idea of the art factory, right? So it's not the painter on their own in their gallery kind of making their art, but actually the factory production of many people actually producing the art of the artist. And so all the ways that you were bringing together this question of labor, I thought was really useful, particularly because often in the past I've had the sense that where art gets criticized is as a tool for speculation in this, again, rather abstract way. So to bring it back to the issues of labor, I think is really important. So I had a question about that, namely, what are the conversations around the movement itself as commodity and Occupy being commodified? And I know that conversation can be very complicated, and often movements tend to eat up themselves from within. Like, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, because that means the commodification, co-option, etc. But there's also, of course, a really important critique around that as well. So I was just wondering what the conversations are right now around these kinds of issues, particularly with elections coming up in the US.
So we are both going to say something on this briefly, but so just so you know, so what we didn't get to, and we really would like to talk about, is particularly the relationship, the strange and transforming relationship we have with institutions. And that has to do with co-option, right? So at the beginning, it was very clear in the first phase, and it was beautifully clear, it was very important that it was clear that we are not going to be co-opted. Don't get near us, if you have money. There was money coming in the movement, somehow by PayPal or something, but we would not work with institutions. It was just understood that wasn't good and I think the reason was that we needed about a month to develop our culture without working with the man, right? Maybe eventually you need to work with institutions to have things change. And in fact, we have moved on and are working with institutions. And there's a very interesting phenomenon, particularly here in Europe, particularly right now, because we've been invited here by George Soros. So the right wing in the US says, you guys are getting funded by George Soros. And finally I can say that's true. but anyway, more specifically, but actually there's been a general movement from being very much outside the institutions, and we do stand outside the institutions, to working with institutions in all kinds of ways, from personal relationships that we have where our allies are inside and outside the institutions, of course, right? Our allies in this are everywhere. In the press, in MoMA. So they've come forward, they've given us little signs, and there's things happening. And then what's happening in Europe is that people are on the next European institutions, which are 85% publicly funded, exactly the opposite of the United States institutions, right? Which are privately funded mostly. European institutions are starting to work with Occupy. So Maria just came from Berlin, so maybe.
Yeah, so we were invited by the Berlin Biennale to come and occupy a space, but we were invited, so it's not really an occupation, but it's a chance for us to experiment and share tactics and experiences and skills with other occupiers throughout Europe. And so this is a decision we made to allow a certain amount of co-optation of our grassroots movement in collaboration with an institution to seek out that potential and to seek out where the boundaries are where we are able to push this institution. Because if we're going to be doing institutional critiques and we refuse to engage in dialogue when they are asking us to dialogue, I think that creates an unproductive, antagonistic kind of relationship. And what we really want to do is we want to figure out how to change the system. And we're questioning, can we change the system in collaboration with the system, or do we need to kind of try that, recognize it's not going to work, and move on from there? So we've accepted the invitation to be in the Biennale, and I've been there for the last week. And it's so far, I mean, we've been talking about these issues of institutionalization and the strangeness of, I was talking to the Berlin occupiers who are like, this is very strange because that is the tent that I slept in the square in for 5 months, and now it's in an art gallery, So, seeing it, we don't want to historicize ourselves, so we need to work very hard to kind of invigorate the space with our energy, and it seems to be working on a certain level where there have been spontaneous GAs of people coming through the space or sitting down and starting to talk about some of the issues of Occupy. We are also having people give spontaneous workshops. There was Italian theater person who had developed a practice around bodies and space and building trust and giving people a voice. And he came for 2 days in a row, gave an hour and a half long workshops for anybody who was coming by in the space. So the energy and the kind of potential of Zuccotti Square and other occupations, I imagine, is there, as well as the conflicts, which is also really important for us to recognize that the conflicts that we see and the way that we deal with them within our own working groups, within Occupy Wall Street, exist in other occupations, other social movements who are dealing with this similar attempt to organize horizontally through a consensus-based process. That these issues are not individual and personal, it's systemic, that they repeat themselves, and the solutions are something, how we get beyond those conflicts. We begin to see the conflicts as opportunities rather than barriers as we share practices. So, should we go to that last image? This last image is from a workshop that was given on civil disobedience. The group in the middle is a group of occupiers, and then the group that were being taught how to link arms and hold their ground on the protest. And the group on the outside is Biennale visitors trying to rip us apart. So it's kind of an amazing situation that's happening there, where people are excited and engaged with our ideas, and it's a place for us to start kind of learning how to bring people into the movement in a meaningful way.
Thanks so much. And well, on that note, I think we should move to a coffee break. It's up now, and obviously you will have a chance to ask questions of the speakers there. And once again, at the round table at the end of there is coffee and tea and other juice.